What do you think, Carl? What is the difference reaction between government and communities in these crises?
Thanks, and thanks, Nail, for, I think that was a pretty accurate roundup of sort of what happened when I was working in Melbourne. Look, it's very interesting. I would confirm everything that Nail said in terms of, I know he's describing it from the point of view of how the community experienced it. From someone who's worked in policy and, you know, community education and engagement in government and understanding the government framework. I also, it's funny, you know, because so I'm talking from the perspective of, I guess, professionals who work in policy and advocacy at the community peak level. So we're like a bridge. So we understand the processes of government and the cultural problems there, communication, and then we also understand the communities, and our job is to really talk to a whole bunch of people that are very different from each other. And we learn that they have such a different way culturally of interpreting government information.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key problems in the way government and law enforcement and everyone define how they want to solve the problem is that they look at it in terms of emergency management policies.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a big topic, but, you know, basically it's, you know, preparedness, response, and recovery from an emergency. And I think most of the community safety planning and emergency management plans that government does, and when we're talking government, state, federal, local, and even companies and corporations that have it and businesses, they tend to think in terms of a natural disaster. Whereas a terrorism incident, a social cohesion incident, and the kind of problems that occur are not really built into those emergency plans. And those emergency plans haven't really had input from the community. I know that WA in 2018-19 had a really good joint parliament, sort of a parliamentary inquiry. And they looked at that question here. I haven't looked at other states, but there is an acknowledgement, I think, in government that they have difficulty communicating with culturally diverse and multicultural, multi-faith organisations. So when we're looking at the kind of problems that we have today, which go beyond just categories of religion and multiculturalism, it includes gender and diversity and sexual identity, and what's termed intersectional differences, where they all kind of overlap, and it creates a certain complexity. I mean, I think it's not unfair to say that governments are completely unprepared. But to their credit, I mean, I think when they've been quite open about saying that we can't really predict when the next incident is happening, but we believe that it will probably be a lone attacker, or there's so many things that we can't monitor. And that's one of the things we learned from Christchurch. It's like people who are completely off the grid, not being observed and everything. So that was in the context of Muslim, non-Muslim kind of, you know, the targeting of the Muslim community. But when you add this complexity of, well, all religious groups, LGBTI and all ethnic communities, and now we've got this thing where Chinese Australian communities are really almost becoming Islamized in terms of their strength and their safety. It's such a complex matrix, and the idea that you're not engaging with community to update your understanding of what is emergency management and preparedness and response and recovery it's unfortunate. And I think the advice that, when we first began talking about this, that's when I began to think and talk to people in terms of, and when I say talk to people, I'm talking about our sector, our multicultural, multi-faith sector, and LGBT, because I fit into all those multiple communities, and started telling people, we've got to stop waiting around for governments to help us. We have to, we have to stop being afraid of A, being called alarmist, or B, believing that our concern for our safety or alarm is somehow playing into broader political things because they want us to complicated, whereas in fact, as citizens and communities, we just want to say, we're not feeling safe, we don't know what to do. So because from a policy point of view, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but the point is, and I'm taking a long time to get it, because I've looked at those government emergency response plans and policies and acts, and then I've worked very much with communities where you really have to break things down into clear English, and also be sensitive to their many different cultural differences. I do believe that there are ways to simplify that process for communities. And I read a lot about how communities don't respond well to the preparedness level, and that is completely true. And some of the reasons people put forward, like I know the Australian Red Cross did an excellent thing on called resilience and emergency planning. And one of the things, of course, they raised was this idea that a lot of ethnic and multicultural communities have come from countries where they define war, evacuation and bombs falling as, well, I'll get excited then. So this idea of preparedness is a really different concept, because they've come to a country which is so comparatively so safe. They've really dropped their guard, and also they love it here. And so they've embraced it. And part of loving and embracing it and feeling safe is that you do drop your guard and you become more complacent. And so the message is very hard to communicate across. We want you to increase your alertness and preparedness. And I think where the work needs to be done, I'd like to see done, is in making that planning process much easier and simpler to understand and much more accessible, especially to the number of ethnic clubs, small non-incorporated associations. And when we think of the multicultural, multi-faith and LGBT community, I mean, we tend to think of, are you incorporated? Do you have a process? Do you have an elected leader? But the community is so much more fluid and complex and unelected. When you're looking at real influences and who people really listen to and take advice, I don't see that built into current emergency planning procedures from government. And I think that's part of what Nail is talking about. So, yeah.
We discussed before with you that, and obviously I'm finding the same issues in regards to a lot of other type of communication, like the vaccine, like the pandemic. These are critical information. And a lot of the time I'm talking to departments and different, organizations, they really want this message to be taken, and they really tried it. The last 2 years, I've seen improvements in translation and interpreting and intercultural communication that I haven't seen in the last 5. But the problem is, it comes down to that, is that do the communities have the capacity to understand that message? Because one thing that we're trying to, blur them with everything, but what's going to stick, we don't know. Until today, we actually haven't sit down with the communities to assess that capacity. And when it comes to crisis situation, you have the added complexities, and if this is from you, that, the communities are, up here with response, unless the situation is like on crisis level, they're not responding that quickly. And then when it's this crisis, it can actually fall apart because people stand up who hasn't been before, claiming leadership before, and then confusing the whole situation on the top. So what do you think in this crisis situation, what worked and what didn't work for your communities? Neil, I would love to hear from you, because obviously your communities have been in this situation way too many times in Australia.
Before just a minute, I just want to also support what Nell said about the terminology. And I think one of the big problems in the preparedness, response and recovery is this concept of vulnerability. Yes. And at-risk community. Vulnerable community, at-risk community, what does it mean? Because I think it really changes in the context of the community you decide to do. And I think in the way, if you're not from that community, how you define vulnerability and at risk, it's very complex. And sometimes what you develop doesn't actually help, it harms. And it's very complicated. So I don't know what Nail has to think about that, but I really took his point about the terminology.
Yeah, well, Carl, there's definitely a lot to think about and a lot to say. I can't help but think that we've gone into a real quick deep dive. We've immediately touched on so many different aspects, and the saying of how do you eat an elephant? the question of how to eat an elephant comes to my mind, the answer being one piece at a time. So it's such a big elephant, and there's no way we'd be able to digest it all in the one sitting. So it has to really be a piecemeal. So let me start from one piece with regards to a crisis management plan. The ICV, the Islamic Council of Victoria, developed a crisis management plan. Okay, it's a very good plan. It's gone through numerous expertise and government agencies, and it's a really good document. But at the end of the day, it's a plan on a paper, and usually it's not worth the paper it's printed on, because there is no strategy with a plan. A plan is useless without a strategy, and a strategy is for a strategy to be taken seriously, is you need real people. Okay, you need coordination of key essential people, and one of the challenges of community is it's a voluntary space. Okay, let's take the Muslim community. Predominantly the members are mosque organizations. They've got physical centers. All these mosques, almost all these mosques, are actually managed by volunteers. Okay, and they come from non-English speaking backgrounds, and access to hard to reach groups is a real issue. Okay, it's even if they're a member of the peak body, their level of engagement is at best a dotted line. And so the issue then becomes, how do we engage? How do we communicate? You can't communicate digitally. You can't communicate by inviting them over to your platform. You have to really reach out and keep in mind that this is a verbal community. It's not a read community. So the most effective way to communicate, to register key messages, is to actually be in their presence and verbally articulate, and then groom, recruit key people that in an emergency, in a crisis, bang, who to reach out to. And unfortunately, in the voluntary space, people move on. Okay, and so let's say 5 years ago, you've identified X number of organizations, and each organization had a key person that you're going to liaise with, but they've moved on. Okay, and the next set of leadership have no idea about the previous agenda, and so it's not sustained. There are issues of succession planning with community organizations, and the recent COVID crisis, it's a health crisis, in a way proved that it's very difficult to get ethnic communities or culturally diverse communities cooperating with you, because the ones you need to reach out to access are very difficult. And so the government was, many different, players. There's a lot of actors in a crisis management, and they were tripping over each other in how do we reach hard to get communities. Well, I mean, if you've neglected certain groups of people for all these years, okay, you expect them to be ready for you when you need them. Okay. For example, again, I'll refer back to the COVID response. Is that the MPs, okay, in certain hotspots here in Melbourne, okay, the MPs were nowhere to be seen, okay, and when their particular hotspots were identified, they were hurrying to try and it was a desperate reaction. Okay, it's not leadership, it's not proactiveness. the MPs, both state, federal, and even local government council, were going crazy to try and say, okay, how do we reach particular groups of people because we need them on board? Well, I mean, this is kind of like, in a way, a result of years of your failings in not engaging with the hard to reach communities. So anyway, to wrap up the point about a plan, okay, you know, it's good to have a plan, okay, but without real people, without effective engagement, without a strategy, a plan is just forgotten about, and the next people who take over any organization have no idea that a plan existed, and what they do is, and even the government departments who, let's say that, you know, God forbid, but if there's another crisis in the Muslim community, let's just say for argument's sake, okay, what will happen is, because the staff, the public servants in the government agency have changed. They don't know a previous crisis management plan with the Muslim communities existed. They don't know where it is. It was sponsored, okay? The current leadership of the Muslim community, only a handful of people know the existence of this particular crisis management plan, okay? The new leadership have no idea. So they start off from scratch, okay? You start reinventing the wheel, and that drains you know, a lot of energy, and it becomes a case of, okay, here we go again, okay? And you know, the Muslim crisis management plan, which the ICV developed with a lot of important consultations, it's a good document. All you really need to do is change the word Muslim to another cohort of people. It's the same principles apply. I mean, you know, one group of people are not unique to another. You know, we have very similar needs, and you know, and you know, it's not mutually exclusive. So the amount of investments which goes into a particular community could easily be replicated to another community. And so that's you know, having a plan is great, but it falls, you know, there's a lot of shortcomings with regards to how we manage a plan. Sorry, I waffle on a bit there.
I really feel it, and sorry, Carl, before you respond, is actually quite relevant to what I do as well right now, because I actually have to, there's a program that I'm running that is built on engaging with ethnic communities. We have the money, the resources, the people, but it's going to get finished and going to get replaced by a generic framework that has one dot point to, we have a demonstrated commitment to support ethnic communities, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And then they're trying to ask me now, as a third organization coming forward to evaluate what my work does. And they were like, but how do you connect? But how do you connect? But how? And I said, look, imagine a tree. A tree grows for years. That's an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that ecosystem is what my organization uses to connect with ethnic communities. You know, you can't just come in and dig that tree out and take it to your yard. It's going to die. And this is the continuity of, you know, yes, the plan is really great, but how do you make sure that you're able to reach out to those communities regardless of what you have? Is that ecosystem that we build, and respecting the and respecting the connections. And I think that's often is really missed in communication. And I remember in WA in the beginning, I was nagging them, you know, bring the ethnic leaders together, because this is going to be a longer term strategy for you, not just COVID. But in the beginning, nobody was listening. They just wanted the message to be vomited, excuse my language, vomited out to the communities and hope it sticks. And obviously it didn't. But now obviously the strategies are changing, and you're wanting actually not just for COVID, but they realize how good is it when we can actually reach these communities and continue to do so regardless of what crisis we are experiencing. Sorry, Carl, it was a really big
I agree completely with you. I would build on that thing of I completely agree with Nail about the unfortunateness of having to reinvent the wheel every time because of this turnover of people, not just in government, but in the community advocacy sector itself and in community peaks. So that's I agree with that. I think when you're looking at different transferring it cannot just be from different community groups. I think that needs to be a lot more communication between states and community peaks at states to support this sort of, and when you talk about making the lessons of one community relevant to another, I think there are some issues there that are now brought up. I think definitely having people who allocating certain roles to people, and like definitely someone to deal with the media, because the media onslaught is just like massive. And when you're in a perfect storm, the media also plays a big role in keeping the storm going, to be quite honest. And you need to have experience, but also some younger people and volunteers in the community helping. It has to be intergenerational response. Because we live in a world where you have traditional culture and then you have younger people who are much more switched on to social media and technology, and they need to help the older people and the middle people, and it needs to be very intergenerational. Organizationally, I think, you know, there are communities that have different levels of organization. So it could be a self-help support group, it could be a ethnic club, it could be built around a sporting activity or a family activity, or it could actually be a funded community peak, which is an incorporated association that has all the bureaucracy of being accountable at that level. But this idea of having people who are given jobs, media, communicating with the mapping and communicating with the most vulnerable people. So, you know, how is the information going to get out there? And if it's not digital and read, it still needs to be given to certain people who everyone trusts and everyone is going to call, and they need to be given a mobile phone and have their bills paid for, and have a backup and go, well, you're doing all the women, because the women are like, let's take the Muslim community, women wearing, you know, covering are going to be highly represented in incidences of racism and Islamophobia. So, but, you know, it could be in the LGBTI community, it could be trans. So we're talking about visible difference and very vulnerable people. So, and part of having different people, when you talk about the emergency plan, you know, the logic, I think he absolutely made the point, it has to be continued on when people leave. The other thing, though, is that for community leaders, and a lot of these communities, whether it's religious or LGBT or multicultural, tends to be kind of hierarchical. There tends to be someone who takes on the work more than other people and gets trusted and then gets shoved into that top job. Now, that person, like from my point of view, my job is to support that process. So I'm often dealing with the CEO, the executive officer, chief executive officer, or community leader or faith leader. They burn out. In a perfect storm, they burn out on day 3.
Yeah.
And they have to go for not just 3 months, sometimes 3 years, because these are not big explosions that settle down. It's like, it's incremental. It's either going up, going down, keeps going up, going down. Now everyone goes to that leader, and they are completely exhausted. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I am disappointed seeing, that, like, I really feel like communities need to support that one leader by having these particular roles. So I really take on board everything Neil said, and I think we do need to have more of that.